Yeah, so welcome everybody to this session about Buddhist ecology by Dhivan. I'm Katya and I'm the host. If you've got any technical problems, just do send me a message in the chat box. So this session is going to be an hour, and Dhivan will say something for about half an hour, and then there'll be time for questions. Do pop your questions into the chat box whenever they come to you, and we'll get to them. Just to let you know, we're recording this, and we're also live streaming it on Facebook. This means you can come back to the recording if you browse the Facebook group. And also, at the moment, you can't direct message each other, but you can message everybody or me or Dhivan. Fantastic. So thanks everybody for joining this Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Dhivan and I just had a chat about like how likely is it that many people turn up, but there's 28 of you, and that's really great to see. So just to introduce Dhivan, he is a member of the Triratna Buddhist Order and also a scholar. So he knows a lot about Buddhism and philosophy and teaches at university. He's also actually a core part of the Buddha Field Dharmapala team. So if we were in the field, this would be the Dharmapala area, and you would see him not just giving study and talks, but also helping out with all sorts of practical things. Apart from Buddha Field, another thing he's really involved in is linking up with other scholars within Triratna and the philosophy symposium that have been happening for the past few years. And so it's really, so I've known Dhivan from both Buddha Field, and I've also been able to come along to the last philosophy symposium. And for me, it's really striking, like somebody who has got such a great mind and is an academic, and at the same time is very approachable, very down to earth. And just like what a fantastic combination of traits in a human being. So this topic is something he hasn't talked about much before, and he's going to say a bit about how this came into being in a moment. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Dhivan.
Thanks very much, Katya, for a lovely, warm introduction. Really appreciate that. So good morning, everyone. Great to see so many people on it's raining here in Chester. I don't know if it is where you are, but it's a miserable morning. If we were on the Buddha Field site, we'd be feeling sorry for ourselves. But I trust you're all in your warm living rooms, able to enjoy yourselves nonetheless. So as Katya said, I'm going to talk about a theme which is new for me, which makes it exciting. So I've posed a question: is there a Buddhist ecology? Is there a Buddhist ecology? And I'm sure the more cunning among you will think, well, that's a leading question, isn't it? He's not going to conclude no, but the idea is, by raising a question like, is there a Buddhist ecology, it allows me to open up the very idea of a Buddhist ecology. And that's what I'm going to do. And this has been something I've been interested in for a long time, but I haven't got round to properly looking into it. I suppose I've had, I used to own a copy of Dharmagaya, a very famous book from 1990 about this topic, and I never read it. I have recently read it at last. So the background to this talk is that I received a commission actually to write an article, which I was rather pleased about, but it was very particular. It was a commission for an article to go into a volume of papers connected with the exploration of the Pope's encyclical letter called Laudato Si. I was supposed to contribute a Buddhist kind of angle to the debate, So I don't know if you've heard of Pope Francis's encyclical letter. So in 24th of May 2015, it was published. It's called Laudato Si, which means praise to him. And that's the first two words of a hymn by St. Francis, praising the Lord, of course, but along with that, praising creation. And this, I found it a bit difficult to read this. I'm out of the habit of reading papal encyclicals, and I found it a bit difficult to read. But I understood it better after reading some commentaries by Jesuit theologians and so on, who could get inside the language. And it turned out that it's very significant. It's very significant in two ways. The first way is that the Pope develops what he calls an integral ecology. So obviously, from the Christian point of view, he stresses, he draws out how it's very important for all Christians, he addresses it to everyone, to think ecologically, but in terms of an integral ecology, an ecology which takes into account other aspects of life besides the natural environment, which takes into account, from his point of view, the needs of the poor. So this is the Pope's interest in issues of environmental justice and poverty. So that's very interesting. And the second reason it's significant is that his letter stresses the need for an ecological conversion. So he thinks that planet Earth is in real trouble unless things change a great deal. And for that to happen, there needs to be an ecological conversion for every human being, really. We need to not just fix problems on a practical level, but to undergo a sort of spiritual ecological conversion. So you can see I was inspired by this article to ask the question of, well, what would a Buddhist integral ecology look like? What would a Buddhist response look like? And so I turned to some research, thinking that it wouldn't be difficult to find how this might work out. After all, Buddhism has got a reputation for being an environmentally friendly kind of religion. But it soon turned out to be a little bit more difficult than I thought. There's a mixed picture. So in the practical sense, when we look at Buddhist history, or rather we look around the world at traditional Buddhist countries, which are all in Asia, they don't offer any kind of example at all. You take the example of Thailand, for instance. It's a solidly Buddhist country, very devout Buddhists of the Theravadan school in Thailand. And yet, late last century, they logged 80% of their forests in 25 years for profit. And now it's a bit of an ecological disaster zone. And they did that on purpose. So Buddhism didn't make a lot of difference there. And we can see similar patterns in other East Asian countries. You think about the Japanese continuation of whaling, despite they know perfectly well that whales are in danger of extinction and are highly intelligent creatures. So this, of course, is not to place blame anywhere, but it's just to notice that a culture being Buddhist doesn't seem to mean that it's particularly environmental. So perhaps we should look more, perhaps that would give us a way ecological. I'd say that one principle which is going to be fundamental to Buddhist ecology is going to be the ethical principle of non-harming. Surely everybody would agree that that is an environmentally friendly kind of principle. So non-harming, ahimsa, non-violence, is the Buddhist principle that underpins the precepts. Its positive version is the cultivation of loving kindness towards all living beings. Taking that principle into our awareness of an environmental crisis helps a lot. And it's perhaps worth mentioning that this principle is not based on some sort of belief in a transcendent God or something. Rather, it's based on an attention to empathy, to the actual experiences of other living beings who suffer just like ourselves. So non-harming is based on empathy. So certainly Buddhism looks like it's an ecological tradition. But then the other principle that is mentioned with regard to Buddhism in ecology would be the idea of interdependence. But it turns out that this is a little more difficult to exactly pin down. The idea of interdependence, the idea that all living beings, or all things in the universe depend on each other, is, as it were, not quite a Buddhist teaching. The nearest we get is the idea of the dual net of Indra in Huayan Buddhism, a Chinese school of the 4th century, in which this image of a net of jewels in which all the jewels reflect all the other jewels. It's an image of the interpenetration of all phenomena in the universe. Now, this may be very inspiring, but it gives us very little sense of how we might make judgments about what kinds of relationships are beneficial and what kinds of relationships aren't. So it doesn't give us any sense of values. And it's somewhat the same with talking of interdependence. Just to say everything is interdependent perhaps doesn't help us decide which kinds of interdependence we want. For instance, do we want nuclear power? Obviously, our society is interdependent with the possibilities of nuclear power, but is that the kind of interdependence that we want? Now, it turns out, in fact, now I'm thinking of perhaps traditions of Buddhist environmentalism like Joanna Macy's activism. It turns out that Joanna Macy's kind of work is something like a modernist reinvention of Buddhism, a modernist reinvention. And by saying that, I really don't mean any form of criticism. It's just to draw attention to what she's doing. She's using Buddhist ideas to address what's essentially a modern problem. So we can think of this kind of activism as something like Buddhist-inspired eco-spirituality. So Macy talks about the possibility of a great turning, the ability to turn towards the suffering of the planet, overcoming our pain, as it were. And that great turning, I'm sure, is not just valuable, but essential part of an environmental movement. But my interest is in asking, so what aspects of Buddhist tradition might already have been ecologically relevant? What could we draw on from within the Buddhist tradition that is relevant for an integral ecology? In a way, how might Joanna Macy's activism be based on a different kind of, on a more fundamentally Buddhist form of understanding of things? So that's where my research has gone. The problem is that Buddhism, like all the great religions, started off in the pre-modern era when nobody could have had an inkling that we could come to this point of endangering the health of life on this planet. Perhaps it would have been hard for anyone to imagine this as possible. It's an extraordinary and almost terrifying and certainly sad discovery of modern human life. So when we turn to the teachings of early Buddhism, especially, what we discover is that they focus almost entirely on dukkha, on unsatisfactoriness, and how to let go of the causes and conditions of dukkha. So the whole emphasis of early Buddhism, perhaps most of Buddhism, is the practical one of healing dukkha, you could say, the human experience of dukkha, which means that it's basically not very interested in the human relationship with nature, or so it would seem from most Buddhist doctrines. Or at least a lot of scholars have drawn attention to the way that Buddhist teachings seem at best to be neutral about nature, and generally to be rather negative about the natural world as the source of attachments, really, and the need to sort of let go of sensual pleasures, of attachments of all sorts. So this seems rather dispiriting. But what occurs to me quite in relation to that is this doesn't take into account certain images that are central to the Buddhist message. Certain images and symbols, which to my mind actually do present a vivid sense of the Buddhist's relationship with nature. So let's turn to this famous image that comes from the Buddha's life story. It's the Buddha's calling the earth goddess as a witness to his practice of generosity. So this episode in the Buddha's life story, this is very developed, but early Buddhism has very little information about the Buddha's life. The Buddha's life story sort of developed over several centuries, and it gives expression to what Buddhists felt is the significance of the Buddha's life story. It's an archetypal story. It's the exemplar of the journey towards awakening. And hence it gets quite ornamental, and the episodes get more adventurous and inflated as to give expression to various twists and turns in the human experience. So the episode of the appearance of the earth goddess took several hundred years to appear. There's a very interesting story there, which I haven't got time to tell you about. But it appears in a biography of the Buddha called the Lalita Vistara, which means the extended play. And it's extremely ornate Mahayana life story. And in this play, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, makes his way to the Bodhi tree. He takes up his seat on the throne of awakening, the Bodhi Manda. And at that point, the hordes of Mara gather and start to assault him. This assault is relentless and terrifying. At a certain point, Mara tries to strike doubt into the Buddha's motivation by asking, what gives you the right to sit there? And at this point, the Buddha calls upon the earth goddess to be his witness for all his previous lifetimes of practice of the perfections. So especially the perfection of generosity. The Buddha says, I'll read a bit. This earth, the foundation for everything living, is impartial, the same to all that moves or is still. My testimony here is not in vain. May she please bear witness for me about this. And when the Bodhisattva touched the earth, in 6 ways, she shook, she trembled, she quaked, she rang out, she resounded. Just as a metal pot being struck with a wooden mallet rings out and continues to ring, likewise the great earth rang out and continued to ring when struck by the Bodhisattva's hand. Then the earth goddess herself, who in this 3 billion-fold world system is called Stavra, the stable one, having made this whole planet quake, surrounded by 100 million earth deities, breaking through the surface of the earth near the Bodhisattva and raising up half her body, adorned with every ornament, with joined hands, she made a deep bow towards the Bodhisattva. And then she goes on to express her witnessing of all of his previous lifetimes of efforts. In various ways, having praised the Bodhisattva over and over again, and having displayed her various powers, she disappeared along with her revenue. So this is the episode of the Earth Goddess. And this has led to this famous image of the earth touching mudra. I'm going to share an image here, see if this works. So I'm going to show a few images because these come from early Buddhist sculptures. So Lalitavistha was composed about the 2nd or 4th century of the Common Era. And this sculpture comes from that same period. The sculpture and the story is developed at the same time. So here's the Buddha reaching forward, touching the earth. There's the daughters of Mara at the bottom of the picture. I suppose not managing to do their thing. So when we think of Buddhist teachings now, in the light of that kind of image, that kind of story of the Buddha's relationship with the earth goddess, we might feel the Buddhist teachings in a slightly different way, rather than them being teachings which have a rational character, let's say, purely practical character, being about nothing but human experience, as it were. Rather now, those teachings depend on a background of a universe which is alive, in which the earth is a witness to this whole effort. There's a connection and a relationship between the Buddha's practice, his practical teachings, and our embodied life on the earth. So I think this helps us understand or get to grips with how early Buddhist teachings seem to be so indifferent to nature. They appear that way because nature's in the background for early Buddhists in such a massive, undeniable way that it didn't need to get into these very practical teachings. Now, in the modern day, it could be that we hear these teachings, especially in a secular mindfulness kind of context, and they're all very practical, but they might be quite disengaged from nature. I don't think that gives us a correct understanding of a Buddhist ecology. So now to move towards the idea of a Buddhist ecology. Of course, the word ecology means something like the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. And often these days, the word ecology is used to mean a more human ecology. That's to say, the relationship of human beings as organisms to their surroundings. So is there a kind of Buddhist principle of ecology? Well, I think there is. I think dependent arising is this principle. So let me just say one or two things about this. Often we think of dependent arising, paticca samuppada, as a philosophical principle, meaning that things arise on conditions. But it's, I think, an unfortunate consequence of translations that we can think of this in a rather disembodied way. So I know that in Triratna, we often hear the translation conditioned co-production. This comes from Edward Conzer, a scholar from last century. Now, this idea of conditioned co-production sounds so technical, one can wonder how it might relate to anything. And in fact, it sounds a bit like an industrial process to me. So is this true? Well, in fact, the Pali expression, paticca samuppada, combines two words. So samuppada means arising. And that's also a kind of metaphor for starting to exist. And paticca means depending on, but really it means based on, based on. So dependent arising really means something like arising based on something else. So there's a sort of visual image there of something starting to exist with something else as its basis. And it turns out that this visual image is pretty much the same as the image of a plant growing from a seed. If you think about a plant growing from a seed, a plant moves upwards from a basis of a seed in the earth when these other conditions, light and sunshine and rainfall and earth, are all in place. So my contention is that dependent arising is an organic kind of metaphor and image. So once we have that in our minds and we put aside conditioned co-production and so on, we might have a sense that the way everything happens, arising depending on conditions, is the same in human experience as in the natural world. Things happen dependent on conditions, dependent on bases. When the causes and conditions for things are there, things start to happen. This is how everything works. So I put to you that the principle of Buddhist ecology is dependent arising, and this is the principle that imagines reality as being like the relationship of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So I think dependent arising is a principle of Buddhist ecology. But I'll take the next step now. The Pope talked about an integral ecology. He stressed how what was needed was an integral ecology that paid attention to the needs of the poor. He drew on liberation theology in his tradition. The word, and I think there's going to be Buddhist equivalents of that, but let me just focus on a slightly different aspect of integral ecology, just to make a very particular point. Integral ecology's also got a background in the thought of Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber. So the idea of integral ecology is quite well known in integral studies. And there, it has the particular significance of drawing attention to the presence of, it's not so much consciousness, a first person point of view in the universe. So science investigates how things happen from the outside, from a third person point of view. This happens, then that happens. This is related to that. But of course, in our experience, we also have a first person point of view, a subjective point of view on things. And this isn't included in science. But to really understand reality and ecology, we need to put together a first person and a third person point of view. We need to understand how things happen and how we're involved with this happening. So that's to say how the nature of reality as an experience. And it's at this point that I think we can turn to our experience of meditation and practice of the Dharma to notice how quite often that human beings lack a sense of connection with nature in their experience. Human experience often seems to be alienated or at least cut off from the surrounding world. And yet that image of the Buddha calling upon the earth goddess suggests a really deep, intimate relationship with the natural world. So there's a hint here that a Buddhist integral ecology might explore the experience of connection with nature. There's a lot to be said here, and I do not want to be prescriptive about this. I'm just drawing attention to possibilities in how we might understand the Buddhist ecology. But I might mention that during the period of lockdown, I started going for walks in our woodland through the springtime. And I started noticing bumblebees. And I bought a book called An Introduction to Bumblebees. And I started learning about the different sorts of bumblebees. And in this way, I drew closer to an aspect of nature that had previously been outside my experience. So now my experience began to include bumblebees. If I may share some bumblebees with you. On the left here is a buff-tailed bumblebee. This is the Bombus terrestris. On the right there is a red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. You might be able to see the pollen bags on the back legs of the red-tailed bumblebee. Only the females make pollen bags, pollen sacs. And bumblebees, like other bees, are completely dependent on pollen and nectar. In fact, flowering plants and bumblebees and other bees are completely dependent on each other. They've evolved together over 300 million years. On the left here is a common carder bee. And then on the right is a cuckoo bee, a southern cuckoo bee. And it turns out that some bees are cuckoos. They lay their eggs in other bees' nests. Who would have thought? So I'm sharing some of the fruits of my walks, and through which I've come to expand my sense of experience to include another part of nature. And what I've noticed as the experience of bees has come alive for me is that nature goes on more or less infinitely. Everywhere we look, something's happening. And I also been reading recently a lot of Shakespeare. So when reading Antony and Cleopatra recently, I came across this praise of Cleopatra by Enobarbus. Cleopatra stands for the goddess, you could say. Enobarbus comes out with, age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. So it sounds like that's about Cleopatra, but really, Cleopatra is an avatar of Isis, as Ted Hughes said. She stands for the goddess, who stands for nature. Nature is like this infinite richness, this infinite variety. When we start exploring the world of nature, the wonder, the detail goes on and on. We're drawn out of ourselves when we turn to nature in this way, into wonder, you could say. So rather than giving you an account of the way Buddhist integral ecology involves experience, I wanted to give you a sense of practice. And I think that's important for Buddhists. I think a Buddhist integral ecology has to be engaged with, constantly engaged with nature, rather than turning away from it. And there's lots of ways to do that, rather than a formula for it. I've been talking to trees as well. I was going to talk about that, but I might have run out of time. That's a big topic, isn't it? Relationships with trees. Perhaps we can come back to it. But it does lead us to my final point, which is just to come back to another image, which, as it were, sums up Buddhist integral ecology. So far, Buddhist integral ecology is rather thin on philosophy, but big on image. But that's a starting point and a powerful one, I think. So my closing thought is another image. And it's the image of the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree. This has come to represent for us the state of awakening, which in another way is the aim of life, you could say. Here is a rather cliched picture of the Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree in a naturalistic environment. Personally, I find this quite inspiring, but it's a cliched Theravadan image. But what it shows us and why it inspires me is that the Buddha's awakening is inseparable from the tree. It's actually inseparable also from flowing water here. But just focusing on the image of the tree, to my mind, this suggests archetypally, as it were, the relationship of human awakening to the tree of life, to the tree as representing the entire interconnected world of nature. Could it be that the Buddha's awakening is in fact his occupying a central place, or rather sitting in complete intimate relationship with the world of life? Now, of course, that sounds like a modern romantic interpretation, but look at this early imagery of the Buddha's awakening. If you look at the image on the left, this is from Sanchi, from the 2nd century. Actually, it might even, I've forgotten exactly, this might even be before the Common Era, very early sculpture from Sanchi Stupa. Here you notice the Bodhi tree, but can you see the Buddha? Look, no Buddha. Early representations of the awakening did not depict the Buddha. There's just the Bodhi tree. There's just the throne, and there's an empty throne and a Bodhi tree. So for the Buddhists of that time, they're not quite early Buddhists, but traditional Buddhists, the Buddha was not a kind of imagined. Rather, Buddhahood was itself this relationship with nature. I think Buddhahood's disappeared into, as it were, this vivid consciousness of a place at the root, at the trunk of nature. So the Buddhists worshipped the Bodhi tree quite directly, and the Buddha as the person whose throne is at the root of it. You can see the Bodhi tree represented on the pillar on the right. And just a final image also from Sanchi. Here's all the animals worshipping the Bodhi tree. So we can see that the Buddhists of that time didn't think of the Bodhi tree of awakening just as of relevance for human beings. They thought it was of relevance to all living beings, perhaps to the whole cosmos. So in this way, by attending to images, perhaps the significance of the Buddha's awakening deepens into a sense of conscious, intimate relationship with the living earth. So I want to say that there is a Buddhist ecology. We can rediscover it in early Buddhism through its images rather than through its doctrines. But when we do so, its doctrines start to come alive again, especially dependent arising, as the beginnings of a Buddhist integral ecology. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dhivan. That was great. And thanks for bringing in the bumblebees and Shakespeare. Thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So there's a question, was dependent arising mentioned in the Pali Canon? Also, what about the 6-element practice? And please, everybody, keep your questions coming. You can just post them into the chat.
Thanks. So I'll take Helen's question first. So yes, dependent arising, mentioned in the Pali Canon. In fact, it's not just mentioned, it's one of the central teachings of the Buddha, you could say. Now, there's a bit of an interesting, I don't think the Buddha, but as far as we can tell, it took a while for the Buddha to formulate dependent arising. It wasn't perhaps it wasn't a way of putting things that was initially obvious, but it actually features there's a famous quote, who sees the Dharma sees dependent arising, who sees dependent arising sees the Dharma. So it ended up being the main philosophical content of the Buddhist teaching. And the six element practice, likewise, it's certainly taught in the Pali Canon. And if you don't know it, this is in the, I'll write it up here. The Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. There's the Buddha teaches the six element practice to a young monk. It occurs elsewhere, but this is the main source. So the six element practice is an insight practice taught by the Buddha, which would be certainly part of spelling out a Buddhist integral ecology.
Thank you. Rowan posted a question, do our ethics go far enough? And continues, no harming doesn't include the problem of neglecting to prevent harm.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. I agree there. I didn't want to in any way draw attention to problems with the principle of non-harm, because of course it's so central, but I don't think it can do all the work of an environmental ethics. It's more like the beginnings of it. So with this principle of non-harming based on empathy, we've got a sort of basic compass for what's next. But as you say, the problem of neglecting to prevent harm is going to become more and more the main problem for us. So we need to build on non-harming to include an ethics of which includes much more definite engagement with, for instance, the human way of life upon the planet. And that involves choices and an ongoing kind of reflection about what it's like to share the planet with other living beings. I don't think non-harming in itself can help us answer those. We need further principles or ways of thinking. Maybe is that enough to say? Thank you. Thanks, Rowan.
Rowan, you can also ask a follow-up question if you want to. So Emmett posted, I believe that one way of interpreting current environmental issues could be to see humans as having lost their place in global ecology. Do you think that Buddhism can give us any practical advice on how to realign ourselves with the natural world? And then in brackets, thinking about how to engineer a sustainable future, for example, integrating urban green spaces.
Thanks, Emma. well, what a great question. I think at this point I have to kind of be rather just humble and say that my work as a sort of scholar and teacher is more to do with kind of principles and looking at Buddhist texts, and certainly we could agree that human beings, to the degree that we've lost our place in a global ecology, there's the danger and difficulty in actually acting in a way that doesn't harm life. So can Buddhism give us any practical advice? In a way, I've been worrying about this a bit, that Buddhism still seems to be a rather elitist tradition, like here we all are we've chosen to attend an online festival. Perhaps we like to meditate and so on. But even if we all lived, attended very carefully to our experience of connection with nature, could that really change things enough? So I raise this question to myself: what can Buddhism offer, as it were? We can be exemplars in our own personal lives and perhaps as a community, perhaps as Buddhafield, perhaps as institutions. But is this enough? How to engineer a sustainable future? This is the big question. It's difficult enough, even in Triratna, to come up with agreement amongst ourselves that there is a problem. So whether even as an institution we can help be part of the solution. I'm trying not to be pessimistic here, but we certainly need some big scale ideas. Maybe to be positive, if it turns out that it is possible for us to connect more deeply with nature, and there's ways of doing that, then perhaps that can become part of our teaching in centres and so on, and we can encourage it in schools and for children, because after all, that's going to be what really changes the future, is how people think and experience themselves. And could it be that Buddhism can offer something there?
Thank you. There are a couple of, I guess, more comments in the chat box. And also James has raised their hand. James, are you happy to pop your question in the chat box if possible? So somebody said, like, around the Great Wall that surrounds the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, and how that is a symbol of human separation from the connection to original insight.
Brilliant question, huh? or observation. Yeah, I'm right with you there. I went to Bodh Gaya and I found it quite inspiring, mainly because of the other pilgrims that were so devotional from all over the world. And yet that devotion to the Bodhi tree it didn't do much for me, perhaps because it was more, it felt like devotion to an object rather than a participation in a living relationship. So of course, Buddhism, like other religions, can turn from a kind of contemplative practice to something much more like a devotional a way of finding comfort in devotional feeling, perhaps. So yes, I'm with you. That's a nice. You've made a nice observation about the problems of devotion. I found Vulture's Peak much more inspiring as a place. It's relatively unspoiled, and one could imagine the Buddha sitting on this high ledge, looking over an area full of jungle, and sort of sensing the perspective of wisdom, which is able to look down with clarity on the natural world spread around.
And then Rowan wrote that Einstein said that evil results from the failure of good people to prevent harm. Come on, Buddhists. I was wondering if I may ask a question. I think in some environmentalist circles, particularly with people who've got let's say, a more diverse spiritual practice, you often encounter this notion of nature being sacred in some sort of way. And I was quite struck when I read Analio's book, Mindfully Facing Climate Change, where he goes into the early text and he says that this notion is strictly maybe not true, and that it's actually, if you look at the early text, it's quite an anthropocentric worldview.
So this is, gosh, what a great question. Thanks, Katya. Yes, so Analio is one of these scholars who focuses very much on the teachings, and he's drawn out exactly this, that they appear to be relatively anthropocentric, and they certainly don't depend on an experience of nature as sacred. So what I'm suggesting is that this isn't a criticism of Analayo, but for myself really, is that Buddhism makes much more sense with a sort of more animistic background of images, maybe poetry, and then these highly practical anthropocentric teachings have got a context. But I don't think that implies that nature is sacred. I wonder if this idea of nature as sacred really helps us, because after all, we have to eat. We have to eat other living beings to live. This is the nature of it. So I think more important, it would be the establishment of relations of metta to living beings, which amounts to a certain sort of wonder and care. And also, I don't think there's any basis within the Buddhist worldview to suppose that that we need that nature is sacred in the sense of some sort of unchanging process. I'm more inclined to the idea that the emergence of human beings into the world is something unknown, but it's obviously natural. And so you could think of, we're heading into what is now called the Anthropocene, the era of human beings. And this is terrifying, surely, because of the possible implications. But on the other hand, this is nature. This is the evolution of life on this planet. Our task really is to, as it were, is to not screw it up, which ties up with come on Buddhists, I think. It doesn't necessarily mean regarding nature as sacred and not taking on the task of coming into a new relationship. Maybe that's enough to say. So I'm sort of agreeing with Analayo and making a different point.
Thank you, that's helpful, yeah. There have been a couple more questions. So Alokadara asks, do you think that the current situation could be a pivotal moment whereby people reevaluate how we live? Many people finding a simpler, less driven life more harmonious. Also, the simple observable fact of less pollution, clearer skies.
Thanks, Alokadara. Yeah. I suppose it could be a pivotal moment if we now make it pivotal. Does that make sense? If we now say, "Wow, it's really pivotal," then people are less likely to go back to normal, which is in a way what's bound to happen to some degree. But I'm right with you that I noticed, especially through April, so many people out walking in the woodland, especially children, because that was actually, it's a very safe thing to do. And they were noticing, woodland in springtime, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't had they been able to go to the usual things that children do at weekends and so on, or going to school.
Triratna Deva asked, could the theme of non-separation based on non-self offer another principle for ecological thinking?
Oh, I'd love to ask you more about what you meant by non-separation. But yeah, tell us what you mean, Dhivan.